Nobody in Harlan Creek, Texas ever looked twice at Sallie Merritt, and that was precisely the way the town had been arranged to work. It was the spring of 1874, and the little cattle town of Harlan Creek sat like a dusty afterthought between the Colorado River and a sprawling stretch of limestone hills that turned orange at sunset. The town had a general store, a livery, a church that leaned slightly to the left, a saloon called the Copper Spur, and a handful of houses arranged around a dirt road that everybody generously called Main Street. It was the kind of place where every person knew every other person's business down to the last detail, and yet somehow managed to look clean past Sallie Merritt every single time she walked through it. Sallie was 23 years old that spring. She lived in a modest white clapboard house at the far eastern edge of town, where the road dissolved into scrubby grass and mesquite. The house had belonged to her father, a schoolteacher named Harlan Merritt, who had died of a fever 2 winters prior, leaving Sallie the house, a small debt, and a town that had never quite figured out where to put her. She was not a widow with the dignity of grief, not a marriageable young girl with a mother to arrange her social calendar, not a woman of means who commanded attention. She was simply Sallie, the schoolteacher's daughter who had taken over her father's position at the small one-room schoolhouse and who was therefore considered useful but not particularly interesting. She was plain, the women of Harlan Creek said, though not unkindly. She had brown hair that she wore pinned up with a practicality that allowed no room for beauty, and gray eyes that, when the light was right, held the pale silver color of the river at dawn. She was slender in a way that suggested she forgot to eat some days, which was often true. She wore serviceable dresses, dark blues and soft grays, because they showed the chalk dust less. She walked to the schoolhouse every morning at 7 and walked home every evening at 5, and in between she taught arithmetic and reading and the occasional history lesson to 14 children whose parents considered her an adequate substitute for their own instruction. The problem, if you could call it that, was not that Sallie was unpleasant. She was warm, in fact, and remarkably good-humored, and the children adored her. The problem was that the town of Harlan Creek had a social architecture as fixed as its limestone hills. The women who mattered were the wives of the cattlemen, or the daughters of the banker, or the belles who smiled at the church social and got themselves married by 20. Sallie had not smiled at the right people at the right time, and her father's modest income had left her without the social currency the town respected, and so she had, gradually and without anyone choosing it deliberately, become invisible. That was the way things stood on the morning in April of 1874, when Dexter Abbott rode into Harlan Creek. He came in from the south, which was the cattle trail direction, and he came in with a trail-worn look that spoke of long months on the open range. He was 30 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the edges of his hat brim and a jaw that carried several days' worth of dark stubble. He had steady, dark eyes, the kind that moved slowly and deliberately, taking in everything around him without seeming to rush. He wore a plain canvas duster over a blue shirt, and his horse was a big black quarter horse named Cato that walked with the easy confidence of an animal that had covered 1,000 miles and was prepared to cover 1,000 more. Dexter Abbott was a working cowboy, which meant he had been employed by the Kessler Ranch for the past 4 years as a trail hand and drover, moving longhorn cattle between South Texas and the Kansas railheads. He was not a gunfighter, not a gambler, not a man of particular drama. He was a man who was exceptionally good at keeping cattle moving, at reading weather, at mending fences and identifying the early signs of cattle sickness, and at working from before dawn until after dark without complaint. His reputation along the trail was that of a man who was quiet but worth listening to when he spoke. He had come to Harlan Creek because the Kessler Ranch had a winter grazing arrangement with a local rancher named Porter, and Dexter had been sent ahead to settle accounts, rest up, and wait for the main herd to come through in 3 weeks. It was the kind of errand given to a man the boss trusted, which said everything about Dexter that needed saying. He rode down Main Street that first morning, taking in the town with his slow, careful eyes, and tied Cotto up at the rail outside the general store. He needed provisions, a place to sleep, and information about the Porter Ranch. He pushed through the door of the general store and found himself in the cool, dim interior that smelled of coffee and sawdust and dried herbs. That was when he first saw Sallie Merritt. She was standing at the counter, her back partly turned to him, and she was in the middle of what appeared to be a negotiation with the store owner, a heavy-set man named Clarence Webb. She was holding a small list and pointing to something on a shelf behind the counter, and she was speaking quietly but with a precision that suggested she knew exactly what she wanted and was not going to be talked out of it. "I need the spelling primer, Clarence, the one with the blue cover that came in from San Antonio," she was saying. "I put in the order 6 weeks ago, and the children need it before the end of the school term." Clarence Webb was scratching the back of his neck with the expression of a man who had lost track of an order and did not particularly want to admit it. "Miss Merritt, now, I believe that shipment got delayed on account of the rain flooding the South Road. I expect it'll come in on the next wagon, which ought to have been last week," Sallie said, and there was no sharpness in her voice, just a gentle, unmovable patience that was somehow more effective than sharpness. "I understand about the rain, Clarence. I truly do. But I also need you to understand that I have 8 children who have read everything available to them twice over, and they are ready for the next level. So I am asking you, respectfully, whether you might send a letter on my behalf with the next rider going toward San Antonio." Clarence sighed. "Yes, ma'am, I'll do that." "Thank you," she said, and there was a genuine warmth in it that softened the whole exchange. She picked up her small package of other purchased goods from the counter, tucked it under her arm, and turned to leave. She nearly walked directly into Dexter, who had stopped just inside the doorway. She pulled up short, and for a moment they were close enough that he could see the pale silver of her eyes and the fine crease of surprise between her brows, and the way the morning light came through the store window and caught in the plain brown of her hair. "I beg your pardon," she said, stepping to the side. "I did not see you standing there." "No harm done, ma'am," Dexter said. He stepped aside and held the door open so she could pass, and she nodded with a small, polite smile and walked out into the morning light. He watched her go. He did not know why exactly, except that there was something in the way she carried herself, that particular combination of dignity and practicality and quiet warmth, that caught his attention the way a clear spring catches the eye in dry country. He watched her cross the street, and he watched her until she turned at the corner, and then he turned back to the business of the general store. But he thought about her for the rest of that morning. He found a room at the town's small boarding house, operated by a widow named Mrs. Etta Blanchard, who was efficient and talkative and provided 3 meals a day and enough gossip to reconstruct the entire social history of Harlan Creek within the span of a single supper. It was over that first supper, surrounded by the smell of pan-fried pork chops and cornbread, that Dexter began to understand the particular geography of the town he had landed in. Mrs. Blanchard had 3 other boarders at that moment. A traveling dry goods salesman named Mr. Pickwick, who came through every 2 months, a young man named Foster who was clerking at the bank, and an older gentleman named Hatchett who did not explain what he did and whom nobody seemed inclined to ask. At the supper table the conversation ranged broadly, and Dexter was content to listen and respond when addressed. "You'll find Harlan Creek a decent little place," Mrs. Blanchard said, settling a dish of boiled beans on the table with authority. "It's small, mind you, but we've got most things a person needs. Good church, good people. The Caldwell family runs most of the cattle business through here. Hester Caldwell is the one to know if you're wanting to understand how things work." "I expect I'll be calling on Mr. Porter before too long," Dexter said. "It's cattle business brought me through." "Porter's all right," the young clerk Foster offered. He's west of town about 4 miles. Good land, decent operation. He paused and seemed to be working himself up to something, the way young men do when they want to appear knowledgeable. Porter throws the best harvest social in October, brings the whole town together. Well, he glanced at Pickwick. Most of the town. Most of it, Dexter asked. Mrs. Blanchard made a small sound that was not quite a snort but was in the same family. There are some folks who don't really get folded into those occasions. It's nothing personal, you understand, just the way things fall out. Miss Merritt, for instance, she's out at her father's old house. She teaches the school, a fine girl really, but she's not well. She doesn't quite fit into the Caldwell circle. Dexter set down his fork. Merritt, he said, is that the woman who teaches over at the schoolhouse? That's her. Brown hair, gray eyes, always got a book or a paper tucked under her arm. She's been here all her life, grew up here, very capable woman. A little lonely, I think, though she'd never say so. Mrs. Blanchard's voice carried a sort of mild sympathy that fell short of advocacy. She keeps to herself mostly. Dexter picked his fork back up and said nothing more on the subject that evening. But the picture he was assembling in his mind was becoming clearer and more specific with every detail. The following morning, Dexter rose before 6, saw Toccato at the livery, and took a walk around the perimeter of the town in the early light. He liked mornings in new places because the quiet showed you the real shape of things. He walked along the north side of Main Street, past the Copper Spur, which was locked and sleeping, and past the church, and then he turned down the side streets and eventually found himself on the eastern road, where the houses thinned out and the scrubby grass began. The white clapboard house at the end of the road had a small garden in front of it, more practical than decorative, with neat rows of what appeared to be early spring vegetables. There was a rabbit hutch built against the side of the house, constructed with evident care, and a clothesline in the side yard. It was a tidy, self-sufficient-looking place that said something clear and honest about the person who kept it. Sallie Merritt came out of the front door at exactly 7 o'clock, wearing a dark blue dress and carrying a canvas bag that clearly held books and papers. She locked the door, tucked the key into her pocket, and walked down the front path. She was halfway down the road before she noticed Dexter standing at the edge of it, and she pulled up short with a small, startled breath. "You again," she said, and then immediately looked slightly embarrassed at how that had come out. "Forgive me, I only meant you were in the general store yesterday." "I was," Dexter said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Dexter Abbott, ma'am. I'm staying at Mrs. Blanchard's place for a few weeks, came in for the cattle business." "Sallie Merritt," she said, and extended her hand with the directness of a woman who was not in the habit of simpering. He shook it. Her hand was small, but her grip was firm. "Are you heading in the direction of Main Street?" "I was walking that way, yes." "Then walk with me if you like. I don't bite." He fell into step beside her. She walked at a brisk pace, practical and purposeful, and she had the easy manner of someone who had lived long enough in a small place to be comfortable with strangers. They talked, easily and without great effort, about the town and the weather and the recent spring rains and the state of the roads. She asked about his work with a genuine interest that was not mere politeness, asking specific questions about cattle drives and the trail that told him she was a woman who read and remembered what she read. "My father used to subscribe to the newspapers from San Antonio and Austin," she told him. "He thought it important to know what was happening in the larger world, even from a small place. I've kept up the habit." "A good habit," Dexter said. "Most people here think it's an eccentric one," she said, with a lightness that did not entirely disguise the truth underneath it. "But I find I don't mind being eccentric." They parted at the crossroads, she toward the schoolhouse and he toward the livery, and when he turned once to look back, he found that she had not looked back, which he found, for reasons he could not fully explain, both disappointing and admirable. He watched for her after that. Not in the way of a man who stalks or lurks, but in the way of a man whose eyes have been tuned to a particular frequency and can no longer help picking up the signal. He saw her in the mornings on her walk to school. He saw her at the general store. He saw her at the Saturday market that set up along the north side of Main Street, where she would move carefully among the stalls, selecting vegetables with the seriousness of someone operating on a precise budget. He saw her at church on Sunday, where she sat in the third pew from the back alone, and sang the hymns in a clear, unself-conscious voice that carried just far enough to reach him where he sat 2 rows behind. Every day he saw her. And every day she was, to all appearances, invisible to the people around her. The women of the Caldwell set gathered and talked and touched each other's arms and laughed in tight, warm clusters, and Sallie moved around those clusters with a practiced ease that suggested she had long since stopped expecting to be invited in. The men of the town looked past her the way men look past furniture that is functional but not decorative. She was greeted, yes, politely and adequately, but she was never drawn in. She was never sought out. She existed in the town the way a creek rock exists in a river, part of the landscape, useful, noticed only when you specifically looked. Dexter specifically looked. Every single day, he specifically looked. He made a point of speaking to her when their paths crossed, which he arranged, through no particular deception, to happen with some regularity. He began going to the general store in the mornings when he knew she sometimes came in after school hours, and to the Saturday market at the same time she typically arrived. He told himself this was coincidence for about 3 days before he stopped lying to himself. On the 4th day after his arrival, they met at the market and spent 20 minutes walking the stalls together while she selected a bunch of early radishes and he bought a sack of dried beans, and they talked about books. She had read more than he expected, and he had read more than she expected, and the discovery of this mutual territory produced a warmth between them that had the comfortable ease of something already established rather than something beginning. "You don't seem like a man who spends much time indoors," she said, looking at him with that precise, evaluating gaze. "I've spent enough winters holed up in lined shacks to get through a decent number of books," he said. "A man has to do something with the dark." "What did you read?" He listed a few titles and her eyebrows rose, and she nodded with the expression of someone scoring points on an internal tally sheet. "Dickens, then, and history. Mostly history, some natural science, whatever I could get my hands on. The traveling bookseller comes through twice a year," she told him. "He's due in about 2 weeks. I have a short list for him if you'd like to add to it." It was such a practical, neighborly thing to offer that he felt something shift in his chest, something small but unmistakable, like a compass needle finding north. "I'd like that," he said. "Very much." He went to the Porter Ranch on the 5th day and spent 2 days there settling the range agreement. Hector Porter was a square, sunburned man of 50 who ran a good operation and was pleased to have the grazing terms settled early. He fed Dexter well and they talked through the arrangement thoroughly, and by the end of the 2nd day, everything was agreed and Dexter was back in Harlan Creek with 2 weeks still to wait before the Kessler herd came through. 2 weeks. He thought about Sallie Merritt for approximately the entire ride back to town. He began to find small ways to be useful to her, because he was a man who expressed himself through action more naturally than through words, and because the words, while present, needed time to build their courage. He noticed that the rabbit hutch at the side of her house had a broken latch, and that the gate was being held shut with a piece of wire. He asked Mrs. Blanchard carefully and casually whether anyone in town did odd repair work for Miss Merritt, and Mrs. Blanchard said no, that Miss Merritt tended to manage things herself or do without. The next day Dexter stopped at the general store, bought the necessary hardware, and was at the side of the white clapboard house by Saturday afternoon. He knocked at the front door and Sallie answered, looking puzzled, and then, when she saw what he was carrying, looking startled. "I noticed your hutch latch was broken," he said. "I've got the parts to fix it if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment. "You noticed my hutch latch," she said. "I did. Why?" Not suspicious exactly, but genuinely curious in the way of a woman who was not accustomed to being noticed at all, let alone in the specifics. Dexter considered his answer with care. Because it's broken, he said, and because I know how to fix it, and because he paused. Because I've been looking, he said simply. She stood with her hand on the door frame and something moved across her face, a small, private storm of emotion that she contained with impressive self-possession. Then she stepped back. "Come around to the side then," she said, "and afterward I'll give you coffee." He fixed the hutch latch, and two loose boards on the front porch step, and a section of the garden fence that was listing badly to the east, while Sallie worked in the garden nearby. They talked as he worked, easily and without hurry, about her students and the difficulties of teaching arithmetic to children who had no patience for it, about the particular challenges of running a one-room school with children of 6 different grade levels, about the books she had ordered and the books she had finished, and the state of education in Texas generally. "Do you think about staying?" she asked him when they were sitting on the repaired porch steps with cups of coffee, watching the evening settle over the mesquite. "Staying where?" "Here, Harlan Creek." She looked at her coffee, "or anywhere for that matter. The cattle trail seems like a life that doesn't put down roots." He thought about it seriously, which was the only way he knew how to think. "I've been on the trail 4 years," he said. "It's a good life for a young man, no question. But I'm 30 years old and I find I'm thinking about what I want to build more than what I want to see next." She looked up at him. The late light made the gray in her eyes look silver blue, like the river. "What would you build?" she asked. "A place," he said. "A real one, something that lasts." She was quiet for a moment. A mockingbird started up in the mesquite, running through its enormous repertoire with great enthusiasm and no self-doubt which seemed appropriate for the occasion. "That sounds like a good thing to want," Sallie said finally. "I think it is," Dexter said. He walked back to Mrs. Blanchard's house in the dark, and he felt, in a way that was both alarming and entirely welcome, that the course of something had been irrevocably set. The weeks in Harlan Creek settled into a rhythm that he would have been content to extend indefinitely. Mornings he saw her on her walk to school. Sometimes they walked together for a stretch, talking easily, the way people do when conversation has become a natural and expected pleasure. Afternoons he worked with Porter's men or helped at the livery in exchange for Cotto's board, because sitting still made him uneasy and he preferred to be useful. Evenings, 2 or 3 times a week, he found a reason to be at the eastern edge of town, and she found a reason to be on her porch, and they would sit and talk until the dark came fully, and the stars opened up above the limestone hills. He learned her history in pieces, the way you learn a place, a detail at a time. Her mother had died when she was 9, a quick, brutal illness that had taken her in 2 weeks, and left Harold Merritt with a small daughter and a job that required most of his attention. Harold had raised Sallie with books and conversation, and a particular respect for her intelligence that had perhaps not served her well in the social landscape of Harlan Creek, where women were expected to be pleasing rather than acute. She had been happy, she told Dexter, in the way that people who have made a genuine peace with their circumstances are happy, but it was a happiness that did not extend to the larger community. "The town is not unkind," she said one evening with the careful fairness that was one of her most characteristic qualities. "They don't mean to exclude, it's just arrangement. Nobody sat down and decided I would be on the outside. It just happened gradually, and by the time I noticed it, the shape was set." "And you accepted it," Dexter said. He said it without judgment, just observation. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "What choice did I have? I wasn't going to leave. This is my father's house, this is my town, and I love the work I do, so I made myself a life within the available space." He looked at her for a long moment. "You deserve more space than that," he said. She looked down into her cup. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things that had not yet been spoken aloud. The evening of the second Saturday he was there was a social at the church, which in Harlan Creek meant tables set up in the churchyard and food brought by everyone in the community and the general organized congregation of the town's social life. Dexter attended because Mrs. Blanchard expected all her boarders to attend and made this clear with the kind of amiable authority that was impossible to argue with. He arrived to find the churchyard already full and fragrant with food smells, and he stood for a moment at the edge of it, scanning the crowd. He found Sallie within 30 seconds. She was standing near one of the food tables, helping to arrange dishes, which was the role assigned to her by collective, unspoken agreement. Useful, present, but not at the center. She wore a dress he had not seen before, a soft gray-green color that suited her better than the practical dark blues, and her hair was pinned up with slightly more care than usual. She was smiling at something one of the children had said, and the smile was the real kind, full and unguarded, and she looked in that moment beautiful. He walked directly over to her, not gradually, not after working the room. Directly, with the purposeful stride of a man who knows where he is going and has no patience for detours. "Good evening," he said. "That's a fine color on you," she blinked. The compliment landed with the slightly ungainly force of something entirely unexpected. A small, startled color rose in her face. Around them, one or two people paused briefly in their conversations, and he was aware of it, but he did not look away from her. "Thank you," she said. "I don't thank you, Dexter." It was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed it the way you notice a door opening. "Would you like to walk?" he said. "They've set up lanterns by the south side and there's a cooler breeze over there." She looked for just a moment at the table she had been arranging, and then she looked back at him and something decided. "Yes," she said, "I would." They walked to the south side of the churchyard and they stood in the lantern light and talked, and people around them noticed. Because in a town the size of Harlan Creek, people noticed everything, and the particular sight of Dexter Abbott, who was broad and direct, and clearly not a man who did things without intention, standing with Sallie Merritt in the lantern light, was the kind of thing that people looked at twice. Hester Caldwell, who was the undisputed social authority of Harlan Creek, and had the manner of a woman who considered herself the final word on all matters of consequence, drifted toward them with the trajectory of a ship that has decided on a heading. She was 55 years old, expensively dressed by local standards, with the commanding presence of someone who had never been told no without eventually overcoming it. "Mr. Abbott," she said, with a warm smile that was slightly more aimed at him than at Sallie, "I understand you're here on ranch business. We're always glad to have cattlemen through." "Mrs. Caldwell," Dexter said, "nice evening for it." Hester's gaze moved to Sallie with the particular assessment of a woman cataloging a surprise. "And Miss Merritt, how are your students getting along?" "Very well, thank you," Sallie said, with a pleasant composure that he recognized as practice. She had answered politely dismissive questions her whole life and had become expert at it. "Lovely," Hester said, and turned back to Dexter with a smoothness that excluded Sallie as neatly as drawing a curtain. "Mr. Abbott, you must come to dinner at the Caldwell house before you leave. We always like to hear news from the trail." Dexter looked at Hester Caldwell and then he looked at Sallie, and the particular quality of Hester's maneuver was so clear and so practiced that it was almost elegant in its precision. He thought of what Sallie had said about the arrangement of things, how nobody sat down and decided. It just happened, gradually, and the shape set itself. "I appreciate the invitation," he said. "Though if you're looking for company for dinner, you might consider extending it to Miss Merritt as well. She's better read and better company than most anyone I've met in the territory." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds and felt considerably longer. Hester Caldwell's expression cycled through 3 or 4 states rapidly before settling on a gracious smile that was only slightly constructed. "Of course," she said. "Miss Merritt, you must come as well." "That's very kind," Sallie said, and her voice was steady. But when Hester moved away and she turned to look at Dexter, there was a shine in her eyes that she blinked away quickly, and a line of muscle working in her jaw that told him the effort of maintaining composure was greater than she was letting show. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him for a long moment, this woman who had been invisible her entire life and had organized herself, carefully and practically, around that invisibility. He thought she might say something significant. Instead, she said, "The apple cake on the second table is yours if you want it. I made it this morning and I've been guarding it from Mr. Hatchet." He laughed, genuinely and fully, and it surprised her, and she laughed too, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh without restraint, and it was exactly the way he had suspected it would be, warm and full and real and entirely worth waiting for. The Caldwell dinner happened 3 days later. Sallie came in the gray-green dress again, and Dexter arrived at her door to walk with her, which caused a visible flutter of surprise in her that she again managed with impressive self-possession. The dinner itself was a careful, somewhat performative affair, with Mrs. Caldwell's best china and 3 courses, and the kind of formal conversation that functions as a social evaluation. But Dexter had grown up in a ranch house in the hill country and had been around enough different kinds of people to be comfortable in most circumstances, and he sat at that table without pretension and without discomfort, and gradually the formality relaxed. Sallie, to his satisfaction and the evident surprise of the Caldwells, held her own completely. She talked about the history of the cattle industry in Texas with a specificity that made old Elias Caldwell straighten up and pay attention, and she had opinions about land use and water rights that were thoughtful and well supported, and she made Hester Caldwell laugh twice, genuinely, with dry observations about the traveling dry goods salesmen that came through town. By the end of the evening, the quality of the room's attention toward her had shifted perceptibly. It was a small shift, but it was real. Walking home in the warm dark with the stars huge above the limestone hills and the night air full of cedar smell, Sallie was quiet for the first block, and then she said, "I did not expect to enjoy that." "Did you?" "Yes," she said. "Mostly because of you. You made it easier to be there. You kept turning the conversation back to me when it went past me, and I don't think you were even aware you were doing it." He had been aware, but he didn't say so. "You don't need me to do that," he said. "You held your own." She was quiet again. They reached the gate of her house and stopped, and she turned to look at him, and he could see her face clearly in the starlight. "Dexter," she said, "can I ask you something direct?" "I'd prefer it," he said. She looked at him with those silver eyes. "Why do you keep looking at me?" she asked. "Everyone else I've been in this town my whole life, and I might as well be part of the landscape. But you look at me. You look at me like I'm actually here. Why?" The question was so plainly and honestly stated that it deserved an equally plain and honest answer. "Because you are actually here," he said. "Because I looked up the first morning in the general store, and I saw a woman who was interesting and capable and real, and I couldn't figure out why nobody else was looking. And then I kept looking because," he paused, and found his way through the words with care, "because every time I do, there's something more to see, and I have not yet run out of things to see." The silence that followed this was the specific kind of silence that happens when something has been spoken aloud, that has been understood in the bones for some time but not yet confirmed by language. Sallie stood at her gate and looked at him, and the careful composure that was her habitual defense did something he had not seen before. It did not break exactly. It simply became unnecessary. She stood there without it, just her face, open and unguarded, and in it he could see everything at once, the surprise and the moved quality and the particular ache of someone who has been unseen for so long that being truly seen feels almost disorienting. "I don't know what to do with that," she said at last, and her voice was very quiet. "You don't have to do anything with it tonight," he said. She nodded, swallowed. "Good night, Dexter." "Good night, Sallie." He walked back to the boarding house through the cedar-scented dark, and he felt, in the cleanest and most uncomplicated way, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The weeks that followed had a quality of building to them, like weather gathering on the horizon, not threatening, but unmistakable. Dexter and Sallie fell into the comfortable patterns of people who have found an understanding: morning walks, evening conversations, the occasional errand run together. But underneath the comfort there was also a charge, something alive and insistent that made itself known in the particular way she looked at him when she thought he was not watching, and in the way his attention organized itself around her as naturally as a compass organizes itself around north. He told her more about himself, the ranch in the hill country where he had grown up, the youngest of 3 boys, a father who had worked land until he broke his back at 55, and a mother who had run the household with the iron efficiency of a military campaign. His brothers had stayed close to the family place, but Dexter had felt the pull of open country in his blood and had gone on the trail at 22 and not stopped moving until he ended up here. He told her about the years on the drive, the beauty of them and the hardship, the way the land changed as you moved north, from the brush country of South Texas to the wide grass sea of the territories. She listened the way she did everything, with complete attention, asking questions that showed she was genuinely following and genuinely interested, not just being polite. She told him, in turn, about her childhood, her father reading Dickens aloud in the evenings, the way she had learned to navigate the social geometry of a small town that did not quite have a place for her. She told him about the particular loneliness of being intelligent in a place where female intelligence was considered ornamental at best and inconvenient at worst. She told him about the satisfaction of teaching, about watching a child crack open the code of letters on a page and suddenly find a whole world available. "The reading primer I ordered," she said one afternoon, "finally came in on the Wednesday wagon. You should have seen Jonah Farley's face when I gave it to him. He's 7 years old and he has been waiting for something new to read for 2 months. He held it like it was a treasure." Dexter looked at her face while she said this and thought that there was no more beautiful thing than a person talking about what they genuinely loved. The bookseller came through on the 3rd Saturday, a wiry, enthusiastic man named Colton who drove a wagon that was essentially a traveling library, and who set up shop in the empty lot beside the general store with the busy energy of someone who enjoyed their work enormously. Dexter met Sallie at the wagon by arrangement, and they spent 2 hours working through the titles, which was one of the pleasantest 2 hours he had spent in years. They argued cheerfully about whether a certain natural history text was worth the asking price, and she introduced him to the novels of George Eliot with the confident authority of someone sharing a treasure, and he bought 3 books and she bought 2, and when they walked away from the wagon she had that particular brightness about her that he had come to recognize as her best state. "You are buying more books than you can carry back to San Antonio on a horse," she pointed out. "I'll figure out the logistics," he said. She looked at him sideways. He looked back at her directly. Something passed between them, light and warm, like the first day of spring after a long winter. Then, because things rarely proceed without complication in the world, the complication arrived. His name was Roy Mabbitt, and he had been the foreman of the Kessler operation for 11 years, and he arrived in Harlan Creek 9 days before the herd was due, coming ahead to check on the grazing arrangements and to deliver a letter from Gareth Kessler himself. The letter said, in Kessler's direct and unembellished style, that he wanted Dexter Abbott back in full-time management capacity on the Kessler operation, which meant Dexter would take Mabbitt's place when Mabbitt retired in the fall. It was a significant promotion. It was also a job anchored permanently to the Kessler holdings in South Texas, 500 miles from Harlan Creek. Dexter sat with the letter in his room at Mrs. Blanchard's house and read it 3 times. Then he sat with it unread and looked at the wall. Mabbitt joined him for supper that evening, a weathered man who had the easy, uncomplicated manner of someone who had arranged his life to produce no surprises, and who was clearly pleased about the prospect of his retirement. "It's a good position," Mabbitt said, helping himself to the beans. "Good pay, good land, Kessler's operation is solid, you be set up well for a long time." "I know it," Dexter said. Mabbitt studied him. He had been reading men in field conditions for 30 years and he was not easily fooled. "Something giving you pause?" Dexter considered the question. "A few things," he said. Abbott nodded and did not press, and Dexter was grateful for it. He did not tell Sallie about the letter immediately, which was not dishonesty so much as a need to know his own mind before he spoke it aloud. He went on the walks and the evening conversations, and tried to see what he saw when he was with her, and understand it fully. What he saw was that she was the most real person he had encountered in years. What he understood was that the coordinates of his life were in the process of a significant revision. On the fourth day after the letter arrived, he told her. They were sitting on her repaired porch steps in the early evening, with the mockingbird back in the mesquite and the whole western sky turning the extraordinary colors it turned at this latitude and season, deep rose and copper, and a narrow line of pale gold at the horizon. He told her about the letter and about the position, and about what it would mean in practical terms. He told her clearly and without softening any of the relevant facts, because she was a woman who dealt in honesty and deserved it. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a while, looking at the horizon. "That's a very good position," she said. "It is. And it's very far away." "It is," he said, 500 miles roughly." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. He watched the side of her face and the particular set of her jaw that he had learned meant she was working through something with great care. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's why I'm telling you." She looked at him then, and he looked back at her, and the weight of what was being said without being said sat between them, significant and real. "Dexter," she said slowly. "I am a practical woman, and I have lived a practical life, and I do not have a great deal of experience with," she paused, "with being someone that another person chooses," she said. "So I am going to ask you directly, because it is the only way I know how to proceed. Are you telling me about this letter because it affects the terms of something that is happening between us? Or are you telling me because you have already decided to take the position and you think I should know?" He looked at her for a long moment. The copper light was in her hair and her eyes were very clear and very direct and entirely without guile. "The first one," he said. She breathed in slowly. "Then I need to know what you want," she said. "Not what the letter offers, what you want." He thought of everything he had said to her over the past weeks, about what he wanted to build, a place, a real one, something that lasted. He thought of the morning he had watched her walk out of her house at exactly 7 o'clock with her canvas bag of books and her earnest practicality and her gray-silver eyes, and the particular sensation of the compass needle finding north. "I want to stay," he said. "If there is something here to stay for." She looked at him for what felt like a long time. Then she said, "I have been invisible in this town my whole life. I arranged myself around it. I made a good life within that arrangement, and I thought I was content. And then you arrived and you looked at me and kept looking, and I find I am no longer content with the arrangement." She stopped. "I don't know exactly what that means for the practical question at hand, but I thought you should know it." It was not a declaration. She was too careful and too honest for a declaration in a situation that still had practical dimensions unsettled. But it was something real, something true, offered with the plain courage of a woman who had learned that directness was the only reliable currency. He reached across and covered her hand with his. She looked down at their hands and then up at him, and the expression on her face was the private, vulnerable kind that she almost never let show. "I'll write to Kessler," he said. "I'll tell him I'm grateful for the consideration, but I'll be looking for my footing here." "Are you certain?" she said. "I don't want you to, Sallie," he said. "I am 30 years old and I have been moving for 8 years, and I know what a good thing looks like when it's in front of me. I'm certain." She turned her hand under his so that their fingers were interlaced, and held on with a steadiness that matched his. The letter to Kessler was written the next morning and sent with the weekly post rider. It was a respectful and clear letter, thanking Kessler for the honor of the offer and explaining that he had decided to pursue a different course. He wrote it without regret, which told him everything he needed to know about the decision. Then he turned to the practical question of what staying in Harlan Creek actually meant. He rode out to see Hector Porter the following day. Over coffee in Porter's kitchen, he laid out the situation plainly. He was looking to establish himself in the area. He had savings from 4 years on the trail. He had experience with cattle and land, and he was willing to work hard. Porter listened with the measured attention of a man who understood an opportunity when it knocked. "There's a quarter section of land 2 miles south of my place," Porter said. "Good grass, reliable spring water. The man who had it went back east 2 years ago and hasn't done anything with it. It's been sitting idle. I know he'd sell if the price was right." "What kind of cattle operation would it support?" Dexter asked. "Start small, 20, 30 head. Build from there. You'd have access to my north water for the first few years, and I can put work your way when I need extra hands while you're getting established." Porter studied him. "This about the Merritt woman?" Dexter met his eyes. "She's part of it," he said. "A significant part." Porter nodded without judgment. "She's a good woman," he said. "Her father was a decent man. Town's never really known what to do with her, but that's the town's failing, not hers." "I'm inclined to agree," Dexter said. He went to look at the quarter section the following morning. He rode over it slowly, examining the grass and the spring and the lay of the land against the limestone hills, and he thought about what it could become with work and time. He thought about a house built properly, not the modest white clapboard house at the edge of town, but something built to last, with a good kitchen and a porch that faced the evening light and room enough for a life that had not yet finished expanding. He stood in the middle of the empty land in the spring morning, with the cedar smell around him and the sky enormous above, and felt, with the deep certainty of someone whose instincts had been calibrated by years on open country, that this was the right ground. He made an offer on the land at the end of the week. The absentee owner, reached through a lawyer in San Antonio, accepted it within 10 days. In those 10 days, things continued their particular forward motion. He and Sallie moved through the town together with a naturalness that had not been there at the beginning, and the town, which paid attention to everything, paid attention to this. Mrs. Blanchard beamed every time they appeared at the same event, which had the effect of making the phenomenon seem both inevitable and sanctioned by the highest local authority. Old Elias Caldwell stopped Dexter on Main Street one afternoon and said, with the directness of a man who has no time for circumlocution, "You doing right by Miss Merritt?" Dexter said, "Yes, sir." Caldwell nodded and moved on. There was also the question of the Kessler herd, which arrived in Harlan Creek on schedule, 11 days after Mabbitt's arrival, driven by a crew of 15, and numbering approximately 1,000 head of Texas Longhorn. The herd passed through the eastern edge of town and onto Porter's grazing land, and Dexter worked the full 10-day period of the grazing stop with the crew, doing the work he knew, riding the perimeter and checking the animals and managing the logistics of moving 1,000 animals to water in a disciplined way. He was good at it, genuinely and naturally, and the crew respected him, and the work went well. Sallie rode out to the grazing ground on the 3rd day of the stop, on a borrowed horse from the livery, which Dexter learned about afterward, and which told him something important about the woman, that she would go to the effort of borrowing a horse and riding 2 miles on unfamiliar terrain just because she wanted to see what the work looked like. He found her at the edge of the grazing flat, watching the herd move with the slow, undulating motion of a vast brown river, and she had the expression of someone encountering something they had read about and are now surprised to find matches the description. "They're enormous," she said. "Longhorns are," he agreed, pulling Cato up beside her. "The ones in the back," she said, pointing. "They're separate from the rest. Those are the younger ones. They don't move as fast." He watched her face watching the herd. "What are you thinking? That this is what you gave up the Kessler position for," she said, "and that I want to be sure you understand what you chose. You're good at this. I can see it from here. I can do this on my own land," he said, "with my own animals, and build something that belongs to me." He looked at her. "That belongs to us. If you'll have it." She looked back at him, and the morning light was gold and the herd moved behind them in a slow, living tide, and she said, "I will." It was not the formal proposal, not yet. It was a declaration of direction, mutual and clear, from two people who had been moving toward each other for weeks and had simply confirmed the heading. The formal proposal came the evening after the Kessler herd moved on. The crew had departed, Mabbott gone back south, and the grazing ground was quiet and trampled and smelled of cattle and churned earth. Dexter cleaned up at the boarding house and walked to the eastern edge of town in the early evening. He knocked at the white clapboard door and Sallie answered in a house dress, with a streak of flour on her arm from the baking she had been doing, and she looked at his expression and understood immediately that something had been decided. "Come in," she said. He stepped into the parlor of her father's house, which she had made her own with careful small touches, the bookshelves overflowing on every wall, a quilt in careful blues and greens on the chair, a small watercolor of the limestone hills above the fireplace that she had painted herself. He stood in the middle of it and looked at her. "I bought the south quarter section from the Porter land," he said. "I've got a plan for the operation, and I've talked to Porter about the water access, and I know what the first year will look like." He paused. "And I know what I want the rest of my life to look like. I want it to look like you, Sallie. Like this, what we have been doing, talking and walking and arguing about books and sitting on that porch watching the light go out of the sky. I want to build the house on the south quarter and I want you in it, and I am asking you if you will marry me." She stood with the flower on her arm and the quilt behind her and the bookshelves rising on every wall, and she looked at him with those clear silver eyes for a long moment that felt important and right, the kind of moment that deserves to be fully felt. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Dexter Abbott." He crossed the room in 3 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her, and she held onto the lapels of his coat with both hands, and the mockingbird in the mesquite outside began its extraordinary performance, and everything in the white clapboard house on the eastern edge of Harlan Creek seemed to exhale with satisfaction. They were married 6 weeks later at the end of June 1874 in the little leaning church on Main Street. It was a bright, warm morning, and the ceremony was performed by the Reverend Thomas Crane, who had a good voice and a genuine warmth for the people in his congregation, including Sallie, whom he had always thought was underestimated. Mrs. Blanchard cried from the 3rd pew. Hector Porter attended with his wife, a sturdy, kind woman named Margaret, who immediately took to Sallie with the instinct of a person recognizing a sensible counterpart. Even the Caldwells came, Hester in her best hat, and the presence of the Caldwells effectively communicated to the social establishment of Harlan Creek that this marriage was an occasion to be regarded with full seriousness. Sallie wore a dress of cream-colored cotton with small blue flowers on it, which she had made herself in the 3 weeks prior, with a concentration that the children at the schoolhouse found amusing and charming. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers from the fields east of town, white and yellow, and one vivid Indian paintbrush, which she had picked that morning before dawn. When she walked down the aisle and he turned to look at her, Dexter Abbott felt the particular completeness of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and knows it without question. She walked with her characteristic purposeful step, not tentative, not performative, just Sallie being Sallie, moving toward him the way she did everything, with clear intention and unhurried confidence. He took her hand at the altar and held it through the whole ceremony. The first summer of their marriage was both harder and better than either of them had expected, which seemed about right for a first summer. They lived in the white clapboard house on the eastern edge of town, while the work began on the south quarter section. Dexter contracted with 2 local carpenters for the house frame and did a great deal of the finishing work himself, which he was capable of, and which saved them money they needed for the initial cattle purchase. Sallie continued teaching through the summer term, which in Texas ran irregularly around planting and harvest schedules, and she contributed her schoolteacher's salary to the household, with a practicality that he respected deeply. The house on the south quarter went up through August and into September. It was a solid, well-made structure, built with an eye toward the long term, 2 stories, good deep porch running the length of the south face, a kitchen that was large enough to be a genuine working room, and a study with bookshelves built into 2 walls, which Dexter constructed as a particular gift, and which Sallie stood in for several minutes, very quietly, with her hand on the bare shelving, before she turned and kissed him in a way that communicated the full weight of what the gesture had meant. They moved in on a Thursday in late September, carrying their combined possessions in a borrowed wagon from town. It took 3 trips. The final trip was just books, packed into wooden crates, which Dexter carried in and stacked in the study while Sallie directed where each pile should go with the authority of a woman who had been organizing bookshelves since childhood. That evening they sat on the south porch and watched the last light go off the limestone hills in the copper and rose colors of autumn, and the land around them was theirs, 20 acres initially purchased with a plan for more, quiet and full of cricket sound and the smell of cedar. Sallie leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her. "We built this," she said. "We did," he said. "I never—" She stopped. He waited. "I never thought I would have this," she said. "I had made a good peace with the life that seemed available to me, and I am so glad you rode into that general store and looked at me." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I am so glad I looked," he said. The autumn moved into winter, and winter was its own kind of education. Texas winters in the hill country were unpredictable, mild stretches punctuated by blue northers that came down from the panhandle with breath-stealing suddenness, and dropped the temperature by 20 degrees in a matter of hours. Dexter had the cattle and the fencing and the water to manage, and Sallie had the school and the house and a kitchen garden that she put to bed carefully for the cold. They worked hard together in the way of people who have the same goals and a complementary division of capacities. There were difficulties. The first cattle he purchased, 30 head of mixed longhorn through a contact of porters, included 3 animals that were sicker than they had appeared at purchase, and he lost 2 of them to a respiratory illness before the end of October. It was a financial setback that stung, and he spent 3 days and 2 sleepless nights nursing the 3rd animal back to health with a persistence that Sallie observed with quiet admiration. When the animal recovered, she made a celebration dinner that was, by any measure, extravagant for their budget and entirely appropriate for the occasion. There were smaller difficulties, too. The particular challenge of being newlyweds in close quarters after both of them had been solitary for years, learning each other's rhythms and tolerances, and the specific ways that individual natures accommodate another. Sallie was intensely private in her thinking space and needed silence to read without feeling that silence was being read as unhappiness. Dexter tended toward a kind of active restlessness that needed physical outlet and could not be still for long. These things required adjustment, and the adjustment was not always immediate. But they talked through every difficulty with the directness that had been characteristic of them from the first days of their acquaintance, and the directness was a foundation so reliable that difficulties did not accumulate into damage. They could argue and resolve and find the line and move past it, and the process made them stronger rather than more cautious. By midwinter, Sallie had begun to settle into the South Quarter house with a fullness and expansion that he recognized as the flowering of someone who had finally been given the space they needed. She planted new things in the kitchen garden, expanded the rabbit hutch, and began a correspondence with a teacher's college in San Antonio about supplementary educational materials. She grew, visibly and continuously, in the freedom of a life that met her at her actual size. He watched this and thought, every day, that he had been right to stay. The following spring brought news that Sallie told him on a Sunday morning in April, exactly 1 year after he had first ridden into Harlan Creek. She told him over breakfast with the same directness she brought to everything, looking at him across the table with steady eyes and a carefully managed expression that did not quite contain the emotion underneath it. "I am going to have a baby," she said. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her for a moment that stretched and deepened. Then he got up from the table, came around to her side, and pulled her to her feet and held her, her face against his chest, his arms around her in the full security of a man who has been given something he did not allow himself to want until it was already true. "When?" he asked, against her hair. "October, I think," she said. She was holding onto his shirt with both hands. "Dr. Fenn says around the middle of October." "October," he said. He breathed her in. "Are you well?" "I feel perfectly well," she said, slightly astonished but perfectly well. The news moved through Harlan Creek in the way that news moves through a small town, quickly and with multiplying detail, and the response was warm in a way that spoke to the social shift that had been happening quietly over the past year. Sallie Abbott, who had been Sallie Merritt, invisible at the edge of the town's social life, had in the course of 12 months become a recognized member of it in a way that was genuine rather than merely formal. Margaret Porter had become a close friend, and Hester Caldwell, to her credit, had proved capable of revising her social arithmetic when the facts warranted it. Mrs. Blanchard considered herself a personal authority on the love story that had produced all of this and spoke of it at every opportunity. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Sallie reported to every inquirer with a practicality that made Dr. Fenn say she was the easiest patient he had ever attended. She continued teaching at the schoolhouse through August, and then arranged with the school board for a temporary replacement for the fall term. She did not give up teaching permanently, which would have been the conventional expectation, and the school board, after some discussion, agreed to hold her position. This required a conversation in which Dexter appeared before the board and stated clearly and calmly that his wife's professional work was a matter of her individual right and his full support, which produced a silence followed by general agreement, and which was talked about for the following week at considerable length by everyone in town. The baby came on the 15th of October, 1875, in the South Quarter house, attended by Dr. Fenn and Mrs. Blanchard, who had inserted herself into the proceedings on the grounds of experience and was, in fact, genuinely useful. It was a long, hard day, and Dexter spent most of it in the kitchen because Dr. Fenn had a policy about husbands in the delivery room. But Mrs. Blanchard appeared in the kitchen doorway at intervals to report that everything was progressing, and that Sallie was managing with the determination that anyone who knew her would have expected. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Dr. Fenn came to the kitchen door and said, "Mr. Abbott, come meet your son." His son was small and red-faced and emphatically present, with a tuft of dark hair and his mother's expression of alert assessment already established on his face. He was lying in Sallie's arms when Dexter came to the bedside, and she looked up at him with an exhaustion and a joy that were the two purest things he had ever seen on one face. "He is healthy," she said, "entirely healthy." Dexter sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small, furious person in her arms and felt everything in his life rearrange itself around a new center. "What will we call him?" he asked. Sallie looked at the baby and then at Dexter with the thoughtful deliberation of someone who understands the weight of names. "Harold," she said, "if you don't object, for my father." "Harold Abbott," Dexter said. "That's a solid name for a solid man." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around them both, careful and steady, and the October light came through the bedroom window in the long, golden slant of afternoon, and outside the limestone hills were turning rust and copper with the season. Harold Merritt Abbott grew up on the South Quarter section, with the same directness of gaze and quality of attention that characterized both his parents. The land grew around him. By the time Harold was 2, his father had expanded the cattle operation to 60 head and added a second pasture on land purchased from a neighbor who was moving to San Antonio. By the time Harold was 3, there was a new fence line running clear across the south boundary, and a second well, and a small barn addition for the horses. Sallie returned to teaching in the spring after Harold's birth, with a neighbor girl named Cora coming to the house 3 mornings a week to help with the baby. The school board accepted this arrangement, which had required another clear-eyed conversation, but which went more smoothly than the first. By 1877, the year Harold turned 2, Sallie had also organized a lending library from the study of the South Quarter house, open to anyone in the community who wanted to borrow a book, which was the kind of project that had Sallie's fingerprints all over it, both in its democratic impulse and its practical organization. The lending library became, unexpectedly, a social institution. People came to return and borrow books and stayed to talk, and the South Quarter house on the Abbott land became a gathering place of a particular kind, one where ideas circulated along with the books. Dexter built more shelves, expanded the study, and eventually extended the south porch to accommodate the summer afternoon gatherings that had developed organically and showed no sign of stopping. "You turned the most invisible woman in Harlan Creek into the center of the town's intellectual life," Mrs. Blanchard said to Dexter one afternoon, with great satisfaction, watching Sallie in the study, holding Harold on her hip while she talked books with a young cowboy who had come in from Porter's Range and turned out to be a reader of surprising depth. "She did that herself," Dexter said, which was true. "You started it," Mrs. Blanchard said. "I just looked," he said. By 1878, when Harold was 3 and the cattle operation was running at 80 head and showing a respectable return, Sallie sat across from Dexter at the kitchen table one winter evening and said, in the tone she used when she had been thinking about something for a while, "I believe I would like another child." He looked at her over the lamp. She met his eyes with the combination of practicality and feeling that was entirely hers. "I believe that would be the best thing in the world," he said. Their second child, a daughter they named Frances, was born in the summer of 1879, in the same South Quarter house with the same Dr. Fenn and the same Mrs. Blanchard, who had adopted the role of family attendant with unquestionable permanence. Frances was, from the first hours, her mother's daughter in coloring and her father's daughter in temperament, with gray eyes and a set to her jaw that promised she would not be easily deterred from anything she decided to pursue. Harold, 3 years old, regarded his sister with the solemn evaluation of a small person confronting a new fact. "She is very loud," he observed. "Why is she so loud?" "She has things to say," Sallie told him. Harold considered this. "I understand," he said, and this was accepted as approval. The years moved in the way that good years do, substantively and with the comfortable feeling of something being built, layer by layer, into a form that has real permanence. The South Quarter house expanded twice. The cattle operation grew to 120 head. Sallie's lending library eventually became the seed of a formal town library, which was established in a dedicated building on the north side of Main Street in 1882, partly funded through the efforts of the Abbott household and the Porters, and eventually and somewhat surprisingly, the Caldwells, who had understood by that point which way the moral wind was blowing. The library was named for Harlan Merritt, Sallie's father. Sallie stood at the dedication, with Frances on her hip and Harold, 7 years old, standing straight back beside her father, and gave a short speech that was so perfectly calibrated in its directness and warmth and absolute refusal to be either maudlin or performatively modest that the assembled citizens of Harlan Creek applauded 3 times over, and Hester Caldwell was observed to wipe her eyes, which she denied afterward. Dexter stood at the back of the gathering and watched his wife at the dedication of a library that bore her father's name, and he thought of the morning 8 years ago when he had walked into the general store and seen a woman at the counter, and thought there was something there that nobody else seemed to be seeing, and had leaned in for a closer look. Everything that had followed had been built from that look. After the dedication, when the crowd had dispersed and Harold had been collected by the Porter children for an adventure of some kind in the creek bed, and Frances had been carried home by Mrs. Blanchard for her afternoon nap. Dexter walked with Sallie back along Main Street in the October afternoon light. The limestone hills were rust and copper again, the same colors they had been that first October, and the air had the particular clean edge of a Texas fall day, and the town around them was familiar and real and theirs. She took his hand as they walked, which she did when they were alone in that particular, ordinary, permanent way that is more intimate than ceremony. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was a question he asked her sometimes, not because he doubted the answer but because he liked hearing it. She considered it with the seriousness she gave to every genuine question. "I am," she said, deeply and specifically, not in the way of someone who has adjusted to circumstances but in the way of someone who has the actual thing they want. She looked at him. "Are you?" "Every day," he said. The road back to the South Quarter house went past the eastern edge of town, past the white clapboard house where she had grown up and where she still kept the rabbit hutch in operation, because she was sentimental about exactly the things you would not expect and unsentimental about the things you would. They turned south on the road toward their own land and their own house, and the evening was big and quiet and golden around them. "You know what I think about sometimes," she said. "Tell me." "That morning in the general store, when I almost walked into you," she was quiet for a moment. "I didn't even notice you at first, not properly. I was so fixed on the argument with Clarence about the primers. And then I looked up and you were there and you were looking at me in the way," she paused, choosing words with care, "in the way that suggests a person is actually seeing you, not looking past or around or approximately in your direction, actually at you specifically." She shook her head slightly. "I thought about it all the way to the schoolhouse. I thought about you all day," he said. She turned to look at him with a smile that was the particular kind she reserved for moments of private understanding. "We were not very subtle about any of this, were we?" "I wasn't trying to be subtle," he said. "I knew what I was looking at." She squeezed his hand. They walked in companionable silence for a while, with the evening birds beginning their work and the mesquite throwing long shadows and the South Quarter house visible ahead with its long porch, and the lamplight already beginning to show in the windows, because Mrs. Blanchard had taken Frances back and lit the lamps the way she always did when she was there, generous and practical as everything about her. "I want to tell you something," Sallie said before they reached the gate. "Go ahead." She stopped on the road and turned to face him, holding both his hands now, looking up at him with those gray-silver eyes that had looked at him honestly and directly from the very first day and had never once wavered in that directness. "I know I said yes when you asked me to marry you," she said. "I know I said yes to all of it, but I want you to know that I have said yes in my heart every single day since. Every morning I wake up and I know where I am and I know what life I am living and who I am living it with, and I say yes to it again. Every day." She held his gaze. "You should know that." The evening light was on her face, and the limestone hills were copper behind her, and the mockingbird, somewhere in the vicinity of the mesquite, was running its magnificent repertoire for the 10,000th time. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the beginning, with the complete, unhurried attention of a man who has found what he was looking for and has never, not once, gotten tired of looking. "I know," he said, "because I do the same." He leaned down and kissed her on the road in front of their own gate, in the October evening, in the year of 1882, in the small but genuinely alive town of Harlan Creek, Texas, where a woman who had once been invisible to everyone had been seen, specifically and fully and every day, by the one person it mattered to be seen by. They walked through the gate together and up the path to the long south porch. Inside the house, Frances's voice was rising in the particular way that meant she was waking from her nap and wanted to make her wakefulness known. Mrs. Blanchard's voice came in steady response. And then the sound of Harold's boots on the back porch returned from the creek, clattering with the enthusiasm of a 7-year-old who has had an excellent adventure and cannot wait to report on it. Dexter held the porch door open, and Sallie went in ahead of him, already answering Harold's voice with a warmth and attention that had never diminished. And the house absorbed them into its ordinary, extraordinary evening, full of lamp light and children's voices, and the smell of supper beginning, and the thousand small particulars of a life that had been built, deliberately and lovingly, from a single clear look on a spring morning 8 years ago. In the years that followed, the South Quarter became the Abbott Ranch, known throughout the county for both its well-run cattle operation and the open character of its household. Frances grew into a girl of formidable intelligence and independent spirit who learned to ride before she could read and to read before she was 5, and who treated both accomplishments with equal pride. Harold was steady and observant like his father, with his mother's precision and his father's patience, and he could talk cattle at 9 years old with men twice his age. Sallie taught at the Harlan Creek schoolhouse until 1884, when the town's growing population made the school board willing to hire 2 teachers, and she took the opportunity to teach only the upper levels, the older children who were ready for the more advanced work, arithmetic that moved into algebra, reading that moved into literature, history taught with the real breath of it. The children of Harlan Creek grew up better educated than the children of most towns twice the size, and this was understood, in the quiet accounting of a community, to be directly traceable to Sallie Abbott. In 1885, Hector Porter retired from active ranching and sold most of his operation to his son James, but before doing so, he sold the adjacent 20 acres to Dexter at a fair price, as he had always intended to do. The Abbott Ranch now ran nearly 200 head, employed 2 seasonal hands, and was among the more prosperous operations in the county. Dexter had the quiet satisfaction of a man who had built something real from bare land and honest work. He also had the daily satisfaction of watching his wife move through their shared life, with the full, expansive quality of someone who has found the space that matches their actual dimensions. She was not, by the conventional measures of 1885 Texas, a woman of social standing. She was a schoolteacher on a cattle ranch, a woman who organized libraries and argued with school boards and rode out to check the cattle when Dexter needed an extra pair of eyes and wore sensible clothes with occasional chalk dust. But she was known, specifically and fully, by everyone who mattered, and by her husband most of all. On a September evening in 1885, when Harold was 10 and Frances was 6, and the ranch was in the comfortable rhythm of early fall, Dexter and Sallie sat on the long south porch after supper, the children both inside and nominally doing their evening reading. The sky was doing what it did in September, setting itself on fire in all the colors of autumn, and the cattle moved in the near pasture in the slow, satisfied way of well-watered animals. Sallie had a book open in her lap, but she was not reading it. She was looking at the hills. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am grateful," she said, without preamble or qualification. "That I wake up every morning and the first thing I am is grateful, not for," she searched, "not for the absence of hard things, because there have been hard things and there will be more, but for the particular shape of this life, the specific texture of it." "The texture," he said. "You," she said simply. "Harold and Frances, the work, the library, this porch." She turned to look at him. "The fact that you looked at me." He reached over and took her hand the same way he had that first evening on her father's porch steps, fingers interlaced, held steady. "I will keep looking," he said, "every single day." She smiled at him. This woman he had found in a small town and built a life with, this woman who had been invisible to the world and had become, in the space of one spring morning's eye contact, the most clearly visible person in his. "I know," she said. "I always know." The mockingbird started up in the cedar tree at the south corner of the porch, its improbable and endless song filling up the evening air, and the hills went copper and rose, and then the deep blue of Texas dark, and the South Quarter house held its lamplight against the coming of the night, warm and permanent and entirely theirs. Harold's voice came through the screen door. reading aloud to Francis from some book of adventure, his voice steady and patient as his father's, while Francis asked sharp questions in the intervals, precise and unhurried as her mother's. The sound of them moved through the house and out onto the porch and into the autumn air, evidence of the life that had been built, year by year and day by day and look by look. From the moment a cowboy rode into a small Texas town and saw a woman standing at a counter that no one else was seeing, and chose, from that first moment and for every moment after, to keep looking. That was the whole of it, and the whole of it was more than enough.